Giant's Causeway on the coast of Northern Ireland is one of the UK's outstanding natural features. Its steep cliffs and deep bays form a UNESCO World Heritage Site.
Tourists and National Trust rangers saw the legendary fin disappear into a magical doorway within the rock face here at the Giant's Causeway.
The Giant's Causeway sits on the north coast of Antrim like something that was never supposed to survive this long. 40,000 interlocking basalt columns, hexagonal and black, packed shoulder to shoulder against a gray Atlantic that has spent 60 million years trying to take them back. Tourists come by the coachload to walk across the columns' flat crowns, to photograph the sea stacks with names like the chimney tops and the camel's hump, to stand where Irish schoolchildren are told the giant Finn McCool once laid stone across the water to fight a rival in Scotland. Geologists come for a different reason. They come because the columns are proof that even chaos, given the right conditions, can cool into something that looks deliberate. Aoife Quinn had been a geologist for 11 years before she stopped believing that basalt could still surprise her. She had mapped flow boundaries in Iceland, catalogued fracture patterns in the Deccan Traps, and spent 3 summers walking the Antrim coast for a survey commissioned by the National Trust, the body that manages the causeway on behalf of the public. She was not a woman who chased stories. She was the kind of scientist who distrusted a claim until the rock itself had been measured, sampled, and cross-checked, and even then she distrusted her own excitement most of all. She had grown up 40 minutes down the coast, in a house where her grandmother told the Finn McCool story so often it had worn smooth. The way a stone in a river wears smooth, not because the story was true, but because retelling does to a legend what water does to rock. Her grandmother believed, in the loose, comfortable way people believe things they've never had reason to test, that the giant really had laid those columns himself, stone by stone, to reach Scotland. Aoife had spent her whole professional life gently, patiently proving her grandmother wrong, showing her lava flow maps, cooling rate diagrams, the physics of contraction that produced those hexagons without any hand guiding them at all. It was, she sometimes thought, the quiet tragedy of her career that the real explanation was almost as beautiful as the myth, and almost nobody wanted to hear it. The causeway itself had formed, as she explained to visiting schoolchildren every summer without fail, around 60 million years ago, during a period when this whole stretch of Antrim sat over a swelling seam in the Earth's crust, pouring out lava in thick, repeated flows. As each flow cooled from the top down, it contracted, and that contraction cracked the rock into the tightly packed polygonal columns that now drew photographers from every continent. It was, in her telling, one of the cleanest stories geology had to offer. Cause and effect, stress and fracture, nothing hidden and nothing needed beyond ordinary physics working patiently over an extraordinary span of time. She had told that story so many times she could recite it half asleep, and until the week this account concerns, she had never once doubted a word of it. This is a story about the week that made her wonder if she had proven the wrong thing. It started, as these things do now, with a handful of low-resolution clips passed between hikers' phones. A National Trust ranger doing an evening walk along the lower path near the middle causeway had filmed something strange. A vertical section of columns, indistinguishable from the thousands around it, appearing to shift inward and then seal itself again, leaving no crack, no rubble, no sign that stone thicker than a man's shoulders had moved at all. The footage was 11 seconds long, shot into a low winter sun, and it was exactly the kind of ambiguous, half-convincing thing that the internet either forgets in a week or turns into a legend that outlives everyone involved. Most of Wolfife's colleagues laughed it off in the group chat. Basalt columns don't hinge, they don't swing. They fracture under stress, and they weather down, slowly, over spans of time that make a human lifetime look like a blink. A rock that opened like a door and closed without a seam wasn't a geological anomaly, it was a compression artifact, a trick of shadow in low frame rate video, the kind of thing that earns 10,000 views and then disappears. Her department head, a genial man named Robert Aiken, who had spent 30 years cataloging basalt columns and had, by his own admission, long since stopped being surprised by anything the coastline did, forwarded the clip to the whole team with a single line, good for a laugh before the weekend. Two of the postgrads built an entire theory in the comments about lens compression and rolling shutter artifacts, the way a phone camera can smear a static object into apparent motion if the sensor reads out fast enough during a hand tremor. It was a reasonable theory. It was the kind of theory Wolfe would ordinarily have accepted within 30 seconds and moved on with her day. Wolfe almost let it disappear too. What stopped her wasn't the movement. It was the edge. She had spent a career studying how basalt breaks, and she knew the signature that breaking always leaves behind. A spray of crushed dust, a spiderweb of microfractures radiating outward, a bruised paleness where two faces have ground against each other. Even a clean fracture, at high enough magnification, is chaos. She watched the 11 seconds 8 times, then 30, then stopped counting. There was no dust, no radiating fracture, no debris falling from the lip of the opening, just a section of solid rock retreating into the cliff, and then returning to flush, silent stillness, as if it had been built not broken to do exactly that. That was the detail that got under her skin, not the impossibility of movement, the impossibility of a clean one. She thought about the mudflats behind her grandmother's house, the way a summer sun would crack the drying clay into rough, uneven polygons within a day. Basalt does the same thing the mud does, only across a span of cooling time that dwarfs anything a person can picture years instead of hours. And instead of a few centimeters of drying clay, tens of meters of once molten rock contracting down through a temperature drop of over 1,000 degrees. But the underlying rule never changes, regardless of scale. Contraction tears material apart unevenly, and uneven tearing always leaves a signature. Crushed grains, radiating hairline fractures, a bruised powdery seam where two faces have ground against one another even for an instant. She had seen that signature in 1,000 samples over 11 years, and she had never once seen a section of column move even a millimeter without leaving it behind. She watched the Rangers 11 seconds until she had memorized every pixel of it, hunting for the fracture spray she knew had to be hiding somewhere in the frame, certain that closer attention would expose the artifact her colleagues had already explained away. It didn't happen. The longer she looked, the less she found to dismiss. And that was the moment the clip stopped being a curiosity and became a question she couldn't set down. Wolfe told her department she wanted to run a follow-up structural scan of the lower causeway columns, framed as routine erosion monitoring the kind of unglamorous fieldwork that never raises an eyebrow. She was given 2 days. A research assistant named Callum Doyle, who was 24 and had never said no to an odd request in his life, and a rented ground-penetrating radar unit that was, technically, meant for a different section of coastline entirely. They worked the tide tables, because the causeway's lower shelf is only fully walkable a few hours a day. On the first afternoon, they mapped density variations across a 100-meter stretch using the GPR, dragging the unit slowly across the tops of the columns while it painted a rough cross-section of what lay beneath. Basalt, as Wolfe well knew, never cools as one uniform mass. Pockets of trapped gas, variations in cooling rate. Layers where one flow overran another before the first had fully set all of it leaves a fingerprint invisible from the surface, but readable underneath, if you know how to look. Halfway along the stretch where the Rangers clip had been filmed, the radar returned something that made both of them stop walking. It wasn't a void. Voids show up as flat, featureless returns in absence the equipment reads easily. This was structured, faint, repeating intervals of density change, running roughly parallel to the cliff face, at a regularity that had no business existing in rock formed by contracting lava. Natural cooling fractures are chaotic by definition, that is the entire physics of the columns themselves. An accident repeated at scale, never an intentional pattern. What the radar was showing looked, Wolfe would say later, chosen. Callum wanted to call the department that night. Wolfe asked him not to. Not yet. She told herself it was because she needed a second data set before she wasted anyone's credibility, hers included. She would admit, much later, that it was also because some part of her already suspected that once she made a phone call, this stopped being something she got to look at quietly, on her own terms, and became something that belonged to committees. They sat that evening in a pub in Bushmills, with the GPR printout spread across a sticky table, and Callum, 3 pints in, asked the question Owufa had been avoiding all day. If it's not a natural void, what do you actually think is down there? She didn't answer him directly. Instead, she told him about a site she'd surveyed years earlier in Iceland, a lava tube that local guides insisted had been finished by hidden hands because its floor was strangely level for nearly 40 meters. She had spent a week proving that a slower draining lava front, cooling from the outside in, could produce exactly that kind of smooth floor without any help at all. She told the story, she realized afterward, less to reassure Callum than to reassure herself that there was always, eventually, a mundane explanation waiting at the bottom of a strange reading if you were patient enough and rigorous enough to find it. Callum wasn't fully convinced, and neither, if she was honest, was she. But they agreed to go back out at first light and finish what they'd started, quietly, before either of them talked themselves out of it. On the second day, low tide fell at dawn. Wolfe had brought a hand-portable coring rig, the kind used for taking small-diameter rock samples for lab analysis, nothing capable of real demolition, nothing that could be mistaken for vandalism of a protected site. Just enough to draw a narrow cylindrical sample from a section of column a few meters from where the anomaly registered strongest. She was not, she told herself, trying to reach whatever the ranger's clip had shown. She was trying to understand the density variation the radar had found. That the two things sat almost on top of each other was, she reasoned, simply where the geology told her to look. The first 30 centimeters came up exactly as expected. Dense, dark, unweathered basalt. The fine gray dust typical of a healthy core. The bit chattered along at a steady rhythm, the vibration through the rig entirely unremarkable. Wiffa worked it the way she'd been trained to work any coring job on a protected site, slow, deliberate, easing pressure whenever the bit's temperature crept up, stopping every few centimeters to check the sample coming out against what the radar had predicted at that depth. For a long stretch, everything matched. The core samples were textbook basalt, no cavities, no fractures, nothing to suggest they were drilling toward anything other than more of the same solid rock that made up the rest of the cliff. Then, without any softening, without any change in pitch or resistance, the resistance vanished. Callum, holding the stabilizer bar, felt it before Owufa did the rig lurching forward several centimeters, as though the rock in front of it had simply stopped being there. Wuffa killed the motor immediately, and they both stood in the cold morning air, listening to gulls and the tide coming back in, neither of them saying anything for a long moment. She held her palm near the small borehole. No air moved. Not the faintest draw or push you would expect from a natural cavity along a coastline where the sea has had 60 million years to force its way into every seam it can find. A sealed space on a shoreline this porous is not something that happens by accident. It is something that has been kept sealed. She leaned closer and listened. The way you'd listen at a door in a house you weren't sure was empty. No echo returned. No hiss of trapped air equalizing against the outside atmosphere. The sound she'd have expected even from the smallest natural pocket suddenly exposed to open sky. Rainwater finds its way into everything along this coast eventually. The whole cliff face was proof of it. Streaked and pitted by 150 years of Atlantic weather working into every weakness it could reach. A cavity that had stayed genuinely dry and genuinely sealed hadn't simply gone unnoticed by the sea. Something about it had kept the sea out. Callum crouched beside her, unusually quiet for a man who filled silences by instinct. "That's not right, is it?" he said finally. It wasn't really a question. Wuffa didn't answer it either. She was already reaching for the borescope. They had brought a slim inspection camera meant for checking drainage pipes, a stiff fiber optic borescope, no thicker than a pencil, with its own small lead ring at the tip. It was Callum's idea to feed it through the borehole rather than widen the opening further, and Wooful let him, because some quiet part of her had already decided she did not want to be the one holding the lens when it saw whatever was on the other side. The first image was unremarkable, rough interior basalt, consistent with any natural void. But the floor, what little of it the narrow camera angle could catch, was wrong in a way that took Wooful a moment to place. It was too even. Not the broken jumble you find at the base of any cooling fracture, but a floor that looked impossibly finished, smoothed, level, as though something had shaped it deliberately long before the sea had ever reached this stretch of coast. She fed the camera forward another few centimeters, and the lens caught a faint shape near the upper edge of the frame, low resolution and half lost in shadow, that neither of them could immediately place. It was Callum who said it first, quietly. It looked less like a rock formation and more like something hanging. Wolfie told him not to get ahead of the footage, the same warning she'd have given any first-year student pattern matching noise into meaning, but she noticed her own hand was steadier on the borescope's cable than it had any right to be, the particular stillness of someone concentrating very hard on not letting themselves feel anything yet. The borescope's short cable only allowed them another meter and a half of reach, nowhere close to a full chamber survey. But in that narrow cone of light, they caught the edge of something else, a straight line running across the ceiling of the cavity, cutting directly against the natural curve of the rock. Basalt does not produce straight lines. It produces the chaotic geometry of contraction over and over. At every scale, the columns themselves are the most famous proof of exactly that principle. A straight, evenly spaced line embedded into the rock overhead was not the geometry of an accident. It was the geometry of intent. Neither of them said the word out loud. They didn't need to. Then, for less than a second, the feed washed out entirely, a bloom of light brighter than the borescope's own lead, gone before either of them could be certain they had seen it at all. Callum swore under his breath and asked if it was a lens flare bouncing off wet stone. Wooful wanted very badly for that to be true. She angled the borescope's own light away from the direction the flash had come from and asked him to trigger it again. Nothing repeated. No reflection answered back a second time, which meant if it really had been their own lead bouncing off something wet and reflective, it should have caught the same glint again from the same angle. It didn't. She scrubbed back through the recording later that night, alone in her flat in Portrush, curtains drawn, the borescope footage looping on her laptop screen, while the wind came off the sea outside exactly the way it always did. She found the flash again, 3 consecutive frames, undeniably brighter than the frames around them, with no reflective surface nearby to account for it. She adjusted contrast, checked timestamps against the lead's own power draw, logged by the rig, ruled out a battery surge, ruled out interference from her own equipment. Nothing in the data explained it away. Something in that sealed, airless space had, for an instant, produced its own light, with no wiring, no power source, and no one down there to switch it on. She sat with that for longer than she wanted to admit. Light needs energy. Energy needs a source. She had spent her whole career certain that every reading eventually traced back to an explanation this ordinary planet was willing to give up if you were patient and rigorous enough to find it. For the first time in 11 years, she wasn't sure that was still true. Wolfie did not send the camera further. She told Callum and later told herself that the borescope's cable had reached its limit and there was nothing more to be gained from a 2-meter view down a 10-millimeter hole. That was true. It was also, she knew, not the whole truth. She had come to that stretch of coastline to disprove an internet rumor with data, methodically. The way she disproved every claim that crossed her desk. She had not expected the data to disprove her instead. They packed the borehole with a matching basalt dust epoxy filler used in monument conservation. Color matched so closely that within a season of salt spray, it would be indistinguishable from the surrounding stone. No visible mark, no official report filed. Awufa wrote up the erosion survey exactly as she'd proposed it, routine, unremarkable, filed and forgotten by everyone except the two people who had been standing on that shelf at low tide with a fiber optic camera and a silence neither of them could explain. The Ranger's clip is still online, buried under 1,000 other strange videos from 1,000 other coastlines, dismissed by nearly everyone who watches it. The causeway is still open every day of the year. Visitors still walk the Grand Causeway and the Honeycomb and photograph the Camel's Hump, tracing Finn McCool's legend with their fingers across stone that has not moved publicly since. Nobody who visits knows that a few meters beneath one ordinary-looking section of column sits a sealed chamber with a level floor, a ceiling with lines no cooling lava could produce, and somewhere just past the edge of a 2-meter lens, a light that turned itself on with nothing there to switch it. Wolfile Quinn still works in geology. She still measures the rock, records what it tells her, and only then lets herself wonder what it means. She has told almost no one the whole story, not her department head, not the trust, not even, in full, her grandmother. Though she has caught herself, more than once, listening to the old Finn McCool story with less certainty than she used.